The Secret of the Indian, Chapter 11, Ruby Lou. The feet moved along across the sidewalk, not along it. This ride was quite pleasantly unexciting after the other. Patrick heard a thud as the lady boldly pushed open some swinging doors, and then she walked inside. The street sounds, the clapping of hooves, the thudding of feet, the sound of wagons and voices and barking dogs changed to other sounds, familiar to Patrick from Western movies. He knew at once that he was in a saloon. There was a piano playing a jangly tune and lots of voices shouting and singing cheerfully. The smell in the air was of alcohol, cigarette smoke, cheap scent, sweat, sawdust, and leather. The lady who was unwittingly carrying Patrick made straight for the bar. She rested on a rail the foot he was on. It was dark down there and the smell was pretty bad. Patrick wondered how he could attract the lady's attention, or whether it would be fatal to do so. He could hear her voice among the other voices. "And who's going to buy me a drink, boys? Ruby Lou don't take kindly to drinking alone, and she never pays for her own liquor." There was no shortage of offers. Patrick saw men's feet crowding around the red shiny boots and heard the jovial cries of male voices above yelling, "Yeah, Lou, I'll buy you a dozen, good old Ruby Lou. Have one on me, sweetheart." "Okay, don't crowd me now," Ruby Lou said sharply, and the boots shuffled reluctantly a step backwards. Patrick could hear the noisy glug-glug-glug of whiskey being poured from a bottle, and he could smell it, too. Whiskey made him think at once of Boone, and so it seemed quite an incredible coincidence when Ruby Lou's voice suddenly echoed his thoughts. "Hey, where's my favorite fella?" she cried. "Where's Boone? Boone always makes me laugh." "Boo-hoo, Boone makes you cry more like it," jeered one man, and the rest all burst into mock boo-hooing. Ruby Lou took offense on Boone's behalf. "There ain't nothing wrong with a soft heart," she said. "The trouble with you boys is you ain't got no hearts, and if you do, they ain't got no more feelings in 'em than a chunk of rock. It don't mean he ain't got guts, neither. Give me a man with feelings, even if he do get through 2 or 3 of my best lace-edged hankies every time we hear a hard look story." She shouldn't have said that. The notion of Boone mopping up his tears with lace hankies was too much, even for Patrick. As the crowd of men above him burst their sides laughing, Patrick, below on the red leather, laughed too, until, weakened as he was, he slipped. He felt himself sliding down the side of the boot and grabbed the red bootlace. This broke his fall, but it gave Ruby Lou's foot a tug. As he climbed back up to his perch, he saw her huge hand coming down toward him, and he crouched low in the opening of her boot. He didn't realize that he was digging his hands and feet into her instep until he heard her say peevishly, "I got me an itch on my tootsie. This saloon's turning into a real flea circus." And her fingers with their sharp nails began to prod around the lacings. And Patrick tried to dodge, but suddenly one finger fell on him, squeezing him hard against a metal-rimmed lace hole, so that he thought his back would break, and he writhed frantically to free himself. "Hey, this is some flea that's biting me," she squealed. She picked Patrick up between finger and thumb, and the next second he was being swung through the air. Ruby Lou set Patrick down on the bar. All at once the noise in his immediate vicinity stopped. The sudden, startled silence spread backwards until even the piano player faltered and faded out. Patrick stood ankle-deep in a puddle of whiskey, the fumes nearly knocked him out, looking upward fearfully at the semicircle of enormous faces around him, waiting helplessly for one or another of them to raise a meaty hand and swat him flat. No one did. Instead, the bartender, who was standing on the other side of the bar with a bottle of whiskey in his hand, dropped it, and it fell on the bar with, to Patrick's ear, an ear-numbing clunk, making the whole bar jump, and to his horror began rolling slowly toward him, spilling whiskey as it went. Seeing it approach, Patrick raced to get out of its way. So if this big bottle is rolling toward him on the bar, it's kind of like Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker with the peach rolling toward them. You know what happened to them. It's like a steamroller, right? It's just going closer and closer to him, and it will run him over. He ran as fast as his aching legs would let him, hearing the huge bottle trundling along the wooden bar behind him, nearer and nearer. Surely it must soon roll over him like a steamroller. But luckily for him, it didn't roll straight. Abruptly, he heard the noise stop as it reached the edge. There was a brief pause before it shattered on the barroom floor. He stopped running and turned panting. The eyes of every person in the saloon were fixed on him, and every bloodshot eye was popping. Vast mouths hung loosely open, bristly faces were paper white or mottled purple. What is that?" gibbered one man at last, pointing at him with a trembling finger. "Boys, am I seeing things, or is that a little tiny actual feller?" Before anyone could reply, Patrick sensed a quick movement behind him. He spun around instinctively to find himself staring straight up at the barrel of a 6-shooter. Uh-oh. Whatever it is, I don't like it, growled the owner, and he fired. The noise alone nearly killed Patrick, although the gun wavered at the last second. Did a red shiny arm lurch against the shooting arm? Who has red on? Somebody stopped him from hitting Patrick. The bullet plowed into the top of the bar right next to him, splintering the wood. The next moment, complete chaos broke out. The barman, who had reeled back against the enormous mirror which reflected the whole room, suddenly and silently sank out of sight behind the bar. This seemed to act as a signal. The giants at the bar just went crazy, bumping into each other, throwing punches, firing their guns at random in a series of horrific explosions. One of the light fixtures was hit and came crashing down, causing total panic. There was a concerted mass movement backwards, away from the bar, followed by a rising thunder of boots stamping on the boards, causing massive vibrations that had Patrick involuntarily dancing up and down on the bar. 20 or 30 men cut a parting through the smoky air as they forced their way out through the narrow opening. One little fellow, the piano player, tripped, fell, and was ruthlessly trampled underfoot by the rest. When they'd all gone, he lay there for a moment, winded, before picking himself up, and he gave one terrified backward look towards the bar, cast his eyes upward as if in prayer, let out a weird sound, and fled clutching his hat. The swinging doors went whoomp, 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 backward and forward on emptiness before coming to a stop. Patrick gingerly took his fingers out of his ears and glanced around the saloon, expecting to find himself alone. But he wasn't. Not quite. Standing a few yards down the bar, the exact distance that Patrick had run away from the bottle, was a giantess, like a female giant, with blonde hair and a rather low-cut red satin dress. It was hard for Patrick to judge, but she looked rather pretty. She wore a sparkling necklace of red stones and dangly earrings and a very funny expression as she looked at him. She reached out suddenly and picked up her small glass, which she emptied down her throat in one gulp. Then she plonked it back in the bar and said, "Well, little feller, you sure would make a good temperance preacher. I ain't never seen a saloon empty so fast. Thanks for letting me buy me a drink first. I needed it." She laughed a little crazily and drank someone else's drink that had been abandoned, and then she beckoned to him. "Come here, little Jack the Giant's killer. Come to Ruby Lou." Why would she call him Jack the Giant Killer? Do you know that story, Jack and the Beanstalk? "Come on, I won't hurt you. I just want to make sure you ain't something I'm dreaming." Patrick walked back along the vast, shiny expanse of the bar toward her. His legs were shaking and his feet squelched in his whiskey-sodden sneakers. He had no idea whether he'd be safe with her or not, but he couldn't manage alone, and who else was there? And anyway, she liked Boone, so she couldn't be all bad. Ruby Lou's face, brightly painted, came down until it was level with his. He could smell her perfume. Well, it was better than the whiskey, anyway. "Okay, kid, let's have it. What gives? I ain't drunk, and I ain't that crazy. And you look to me like the smallest human critter that ever was in the length and breadth of Texas." "Actually, I'm English," said Patrick, feeling silly but not knowing what else to say. "English? Is that supposed to be an introduction or an explanation? I heard it was kind of a small island, but I never knew the men from there were only 3 inches tall." Patrick blushed. "I'm not exactly a typical English person," he said. "You see—" "Speak up, kid. That's a teeny tiny voice box you got there, and I'll admit it to you, I'm a mite deaf from all the shouting and shooting that goes on around there." Patrick cleared his throat. "Sorry," he bellowed. And then he shouted, "Listen, I need help." "You could have fooled me, Buster." "Not just for myself, for Boone." "Hey, say," her face lit up. "You a friend of old Billy Boone's?" "Yeah, we're old friends, and he's in trouble." "Yeah, tell me something new." "Thank you." "When ain't he in trouble?" "Well, he's lying out in the desert unconscious, and I think someone should go out there and get him." "Can you show me where he is?" "No, but maybe his horse can. It's outside, or it was." Ruby Lou straightened up and looked around. The saloon was still empty, but peeping over the top of the swinging doors was a pair of eyes under a well-pulled-down hat. "Hey, Reverend, come on in here. It's okay." The doors slowly parted, and the little piano player, who had been trampled on, sidled hesitantly in. "I want you to meet my new sidekick, Pat," said Patrick, thinking that Patrick sounded a bit feeble for a name in the Wild West. "Okay, Pat, this is Tickle. His real name is the Reverend Godfrey Tixon, and he has a past you just wouldn't believe to look at him now, but we call him Tickle, 'cause he tickles the ivories. Plays the piano, you know. Get it? Plays real good, too, especially hymns. Only not now, huh, Tick? I got something important for you to do. Is your buggy handy?" "Yeah, Ruby," said the Reverend Tickle in a squeaky voice. "It's right outside. Me and Pat here is going for a little ride on Boone's horse, and you're going to drive right along beside us. What do you say?" She patted his chubby cheek. "Sure, Ruby," squeaked Tickle, nearly nodding his head off. "If you say so." Ruby Lou's white hand with its glittering ring swept Patrick up, and gasping, he felt for the first time how the little people had felt when he and Omri had handled them. He hoped he'd always picked up Boone as gently as Ruby Lou did him, but he doubted it, remembering some times when he'd stuffed him in his jeans pocket and not been at all bothered if the cowboy was frightened or uncomfortable. "Where do you want to ride, pal?" "Not in my shoe again, huh?" "My shoulder? Oh, that's a bit slippery." "Hey, I know a nice, safe place." And before Patrick knew what was happening, she had thrust him in the front of her dress, right down in here, which, once he got over his slight embarrassment, was just like being in the front row of a dress circle in a theater, or maybe in the bow of a very large ship. Ruby Lou slapped Tickle's hand away when he reached for one of his abandoned drinks and swept out of the saloon with Patrick just ahead of her like a miniature figurehead on an old-fashioned galleon. She got him to point out Boone's horse, and before you could say howdy, she had stuck her high-heeled foot in the heavy stirrup, and in a flurry of petticoats and red satin had swung herself up on the saddle. Patrick found himself at skyscraper height, with a fantastic view of a street that was somehow familiar. Then he remembered. Of course! It was the street Boone had drawn for them that time in the art lesson at school. There was a jail, and across the way the livery stables, and the dirt road with the horses and the wagons, and the doctor's sign, and the general store. The only thing there wasn't was people, although he thought he saw a few curtains twitch in some windows and the door of the sheriff's office hastily closing. Tickle, meanwhile, had hurried to where his horse and buggy were parked and climbed onto the driver's seat, picking up the reins and giving them a shake. "Praise the Lord, I'm ready to go, Ruby," he called in his squeaky voice. "Okay, fellas." She kicked the horse, who reared a little, giving Patrick a fright, but Ruby sat her mount as steady as a rock. "Get on there, horse. Fine, Boone," cried the intrepid Ruby Lou. And the next moment they were galloping down the empty street, leaving Tickle to follow in a cloud of dust. Boone came too that afternoon. Now we're back with Omri. Patrick had been exceedingly busy since the surgical... Patrick? Wrong place. Matron had been exceedingly busy since the surgical team came. She hustled and bustled them across to the seed tray, chatting to them all the time and making it seem normal, and before they knew it, they were doing their stuff in a makeshift operating theater with the aid of a powerful torch and the relays of tiny containers. Remember, they have the surgical team now, which is amazing. It was Emma's job to keep these coming, although she gave them to Bright Stars to carry on to the team, and one lot contained boiling water with a few drops of disinfectant in it, and the other lot contained boiling water with tea, sugar, and milk in it. On one occasion, Matron apparently mistook the one for the other, and there was a great deal of coughing and spluttering. As Boone didn't need an operation, he had been established to a bed, which Emma, under guidance of Omri, made out of a large matchbox filled with neatly folded Kleenex, and a small pin cushion set up in the far corner of the seat tray, out of the side of the longhouse and its occupants. So here is where Boone is being kept. You can see it. That's a matchbox. And Boone's laying in there, and Little Bear's looking at him right now. He was watched over by Bright Stars and occasionally visited by Little Bear, who would stray near the bed as if by accident, peer at Boone's face scowlingly, and before stamping off again with a grunt of disfavor. But at last Bright Stars called to Omri and Emma, who were just returning from the garden after conducting a brief burial service over the paper packet of plastic figures. Omri's family was not churchgoers, but Emma managed a prayer of sorts and even thought of putting some tiny flowers on the grave. "Boone, wake," Bright Stars said, shifting her baby's slight weight from one arm to another. Her face was wreathed in smiles. She was very fond of Boone, since he had stood by to help her during the birth of the baby. Omri and Emma leaned close to the matchbox bed and saw that, sure enough, Boone had opened his eyes and was trying to sit up. And when he saw Omri looming over him, his ginger, bristly face broke up into a soppy grin. "Hi there, pardner," he said croakily. "What happened to me this time? Did that there sneaky redskin varmint shoot another arrow into me, or what?" "I'm afraid it was Patrick," confessed Omri. "He didn't mean it, but he squeezed you too tight." "Yeah, that explains why my ribs feel like they're broke." "Well, they're not, but they're bruised, but you nearly suffocated." Boone paled. "Suffocated? You mean like when they string you up? Geez, that's always been my worst nightmare, kicking the bucket that way. I never would have thought of old Pat being so doggone careless. Where is the kid anyhow? And who is this?" And he suddenly noticed Emma. "This is Emma, Boone. She's a friend of ours. Emma, this is Boone. He's a cowboy from Texas." Emma stretched out her hand, and Boone solemnly took hold of the nail of one finger and shook it. "It's a right privilege, ma'am," he said courteously. "You know, with that fair hair of yours and them eyes as blue as the midday sun, you sure remind me of the lady I know. Of course, you're a mite younger than she is." He stared a while longer. Who do you think maybe Emma reminds him of? A lady he knows. Maybe Ruby Lou? "Hey, he said, I'm feeling better every minute. You know, there ain't nothing like being close to a beautiful female than bringing out a red-blooded dying man's back-of-the-hand living, and unless maybe I need one other thing. And he took a swallow. Ami sighed and glanced at Emma. You want a drink, he said resignedly. Just a little shot, Boone wheeled, indicating the minutest possible portion between finger and thumb. It's the best cure there is for suffocation. Okay, said Omri. I'll fetch you some. Emma, you chat with him and tell him where Patrick is, and that ought to keep his mind off his thirst. Omri went downstairs to the living room where the drink cupboard was. His father was no drinker, but he always kept a bottle of scotch and some wine and beer handy, together with glasses of the appropriate size and shape. Omri chose a tiny liqueur glass and was just pouring a small portion of scotch into it when his father walked in the room and caught him red-handed. Omri, what on earth are you doing? The question was not really angry, just incredulous, and Omri stood there with the whiskey bottle in one hand and a little glass in the other, the very picture of guilt. I'm pouring a drink? Well, that's the wrong glass for scotch, said his father, as if he couldn't think of anything else to say. He walked across, took the bottle out of Omri's hand, and replaced the top. There was a silence, and then he said, Well, you've poured it. You might as well drink it. Why would a father say that? I think he's maybe trying to teach him a lesson because it tastes nasty, right? It tastes a lot like, terrible, terrible taste. So that's not who it was for, right? Omri didn't want this drink. He was pouring it for his friend Boone. But he can't explain that. Omri stared at the brown liquid in the glass. He wanted to say, it's not for me, or I don't want it, but he knew that if he did, more questions, unanswerable questions, would be sure to follow. So he took a deep breath, and with a feeling like despair, he swallowed it in one gulp. Oh, the stuff was horrible. It seemed to stick in his throat, making him choke, and his eyes sprouted tears, and when it finally went down, it burned all the way and hit his unsuspecting stomach like a small depth charge. He was aware that his father was watching him curiously. You're evidently not really into hard liquor, he said, looking at Omri's red face and teary eyes. Omri said nothing. Was it just an experiment, then? His father said. Sort of, said Omri. Well, try anything once. That's my motto, just once in this case. And he put the bottle away firmly. Omri moved toward the door, trying to get rid of that filthy taste in his mouth. And just when he got there, his father said, I think it's time I drove them back. Who? Oh, Emma, you mean? And Patrick. Patrick, said Omri. He's up in your room, isn't he? Yeah, but he's asleep. What do you mean? He was dead tired and he fell asleep, and well, I thought he could maybe spend the night. Is that okay with his mother? Omri mumbled something and said, I'll tell Emma to come down. Later, Emma made a secret phone call to Omri from her home to say that she'd told Patrick's mother that Patrick had returned safely to Omri's after his bicycle ride, so tired he'd fallen asleep right away, and that though annoyed, Patrick's mother had resigned herself to staying in town for another night. I'll just give him tonight, said Omri. What he said about staying a week is ridiculous. I'll bring him back in the morning. Emma said nothing for a moment and then said, I hated having to leave you. I didn't want to miss anything. Would you please give my love to Boone and Bright Stars and Little Bear and the baby and Matron? Yeah, Matron wouldn't appreciate that, said Omri. She's above all that. But something in the intensity of feeling in Emma's voice pleased him. I'll see you at school tomorrow, he said, and don't forget, not a word to anyone. No exceptions. Promise? And Emma replied, I already did promise. But just the same, Omri hardly slept all night. Because now somebody else is in on the secret, right?